Every morning before dawn, Paris was confronted by the sight of tens of thousands of people descending upon the city's half-dozen marketplaces. They were the housewives and washerwomen of yesteryear, afflicted by the same woe they had been in October 1789, a crippling lack of food and too many mouths to feed. Their shambling forms unfurled from the working-class neighbourhoods of the north and east, carrying on with all the joy of a funeral procession. As the women went, they shuffled past the debris of the previous evening, a corpse or two being collected by the gravers, a store owner sweeping away the glass from their shopfront, red-capped sans-culottes staggering home, still drunk from the night before. The National Guard were out in numbers, stationed at strategic locations along the Seine, brandishing their bayonets to disperse mobs before they formed. But the women were no threat. They were angry, muttering curses beneath haggard breaths, yet it was the thought of their children back home that drove them, not a desire to man the barricades. Husbands, brothers, uncles and sons, they were out there too. That is if they weren't out serving in the army, or work in the fields, or, God forbid, already dead. Unlucky if you had jobs, but for a majority of men who didn't, they joined the throng at the Place de Grève or other city squares, hoping to find a job before the next round of conscription. Presuming he had a job, the money a worker brought in was likely the only income a family had. And even when the housewives did have some money, it didn't matter. There was precious little food that could be afforded. Price limits had been lifted, and the merchant speculators swooped in, taking delight in charging whatever they liked from a population so desperate they had no choice but to cough up. Nonetheless, every single day, in the pouring rain or the glare of the sun, the women huddled in queues that stretched down entire streets, hoping against hope that something would be left by the time they reached the front. Put yourself in their shoes. Purchasing only the refuse grain, in better times fit only for animal feed, still cost you around half your family's income. What was left had to pay for rent, for fuel, for clothing. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But what choice do you really have? The kids are hungry. You can't leave empty-handed. Clutching a bag of mouldy rye, you know there won't be enough for a loaf of bread that could sustain the entire family. There would only be enough for a thin, oatmeal-like gruel to feed just the children. For yet another day you'll have to do without. How much longer can this last, you wonder, before you are one of the pallid corpses ignored in the morning march? This snapshot of Paris life describes the summer of 1794, the month of May, Floréal, year 2 of the Republic. Widespread poverty, not just in the urban centres, but also out in the countryside, has been an ever-present feature of the revolution thus far. What makes May so bad, however, is that it was the month where everything went tits up all at once. A confluence of economic factors converged to trigger a storm the Committee of Public Safety was scarcely able to weather. What would later be known as the May Crisis had its epicentre in Paris, and we will focus on the capital, but just know that similar woes were facing every city in the nation. The crisis began, as is so often the case, with a failed harvest, or more accurately, the threat of a failed harvest. European harvests happen in northern summer, a period lasting roughly from June through to September. Preparations for the harvest, however, begin in late spring, in the month of May. And all signs pointed in the same direction. This year's would underperform. This was not a surprise to the Committee of Public Safety. Robert Lindet of the newly christened Committee of Commerce and Supply was keenly aware that the agricultural sector was under dire threat since at least 1793. The main problems were threefold: over-provisioning for the army, poor profitability for the farmers due to the low sale prices enforced by the Maximum, and lastly, outdated and outmoded agricultural techniques leading to diminished yields. From January through to March, Lindet had worked hand in glove with his fellow economic liberals, Carnot, Prieur and Barrère, to remedy these issues. They couldn't really do much about the army provisioning. The army needed what it needed, and it always needed more. Though some of the French armies were feeding themselves, they still required stupendous amounts of food, fodder, pack animals and horses. The best the committee could do really was bring the war to a swift conclusion, and how likely was that? On the issue of the Maximum, well, we've seen how the Ventose laws effectively killed it. This was done to promote free trade, which Lindet and company reckoned would solve most of the economic woes facing the farmers and the merchants. The specific problem the repeal was meant to solve was that of profitability. Under the Maximum, prices were set in Paris and fixed in place. Only representatives on mission or local authorities had the ability to alter the prices. The prices themselves were set low, low enough that a poor Parisian housewife could afford, with meagre funds, to feed her family. This was good for the poor, but the merchants claimed to suffer. They purchased raw foodstuffs wholesale, and then transported it to cities where it was sold for a profit. However, they complained that the price ceilings imposed by the Maximum ate into their profits too much, and so they felt forced to buy cheap from the farmers. This meant that low profitability was passed down to the farmers. Now this cycle certainly did exist, though it was obviously in the best interest of the merchants to overstate the harm it caused them. Linde and company were certainly sympathetic to them, but what swayed them was an understanding that if the farmers were barely making ends meet, then that threatened the whole agricultural sector, and thus the whole economy. But were the farmers really suffering all that much? Now, this question bleeds into the third issue identified by Linde: outdated agricultural techniques. 4/5 of the land in France was, as we know, farmland, and most of the population was needed to work that land. They had done so for centuries, and would like nothing more than to continue to do so. A small portion of farmers were pretty well off. They had modest, semi-industrialized corporate farms that churned out all sorts of agricultural goods. Their problems were mostly in getting enough cheap labor, especially during the harvest. We'll get back to the well-off farmers in a bit, but just know that they're doing alright. Most farmers, however, were not so lucky. Peasant families made up the majority of farmers and worked hard for minimal return. They lived in villages and worked plots of land that were now legally recognized as being privately owned, usually by the paterfamilias of the peasant family. An individual failed harvest, or the loss of the working men, was life or death for these small family farms. None of this was new, and the solution was as old as agriculture itself. Village farmland was co-owned by the villagers. What that would mean in practice is that, let's say a village has 10 acres of farmland and 10 families, instead of each family owning 1 acre individually, they would all own 1/10 of all 10 acres. This spreads out the cost of maintaining the land, means that any disputes over who gets the best land are moot, and also mitigates the fallout of a single botched harvest. If one of your barley plots fails due to blight, you still have 9 others to rely on. Since the revolution began, villagers had been trying to get central authorities to recognise communal ownership of land. But that was something that no revolutionary government was willing to do, for a number of good reasons. The first was ideological. The revolutionaries were men of the Enlightenment, and even the most radical of them valued individual property rights over communal ownership, believing as they did that communalism was a relic of feudalism. Their concrete objection was that the practice was straight up inefficient. Communal ownership required the peasants to devote a lot more time to harvesting the same amount of land, what with travelling across the village and having multiple little plots to manage as opposed to just one big one. It also encouraged them to diversify and not focus in on a single crop, leading to a decrease in overall yields and fluctuations year to year. It was not uncommon for an entire plot to be left untended because a peasant family simply could not spare the time nor resources. The solution endorsed by the revolutionaries was something called, in France at least, métayage, but it's more commonly known as sharecropping. Métayage has its origins in the seigneurial system, wherein farmland is privately owned and tenant farmers invited to live on and harvest the land in exchange for paying rent to the owner and giving them a majority of the harvest. Métayage survived the destruction of the seigneurial system because the revolutionaries merely substituted noble landlords for private property owners. With so much farmland confiscated from counter-revolutionaries or vacated by the émigrés, it was usually gobbled up by the well-off farmers. They, however, faced stiff competition from the small-time village farmers, who banded together to purchase vacant land. Petitions went out to Paris from the villagers demanding non-competitive auctions. But as ever, the revolutionaries favoured private interests over communal ones. So what the committee did was enforce sharecropping, despite the resentment it caused. The Committee of Commerce and Supply also investigated new scientific farming techniques, and issued instructions to the peasants showing these methods, but little came of it. The peasants were set in their ways. Increasingly, therefore, the committee was forced to rely upon the larger corporate farms to bear the load. But here too there were problems. Firstly, the committee basically gave big farmers a free hand to do with their land as they wished, meaning that most would prefer to sell their crops for export and not on the less profitable domestic market, a demand to which the committee caved. And even though corporate farms had greater yields than those of independent or communal farms, owing to their use of modern techniques and equipment, it came at the cost of the health of the land. Crop rotation was largely ignored in the short-term quest for more food, and forests on private land were cut down on a devastating scale. Around a quarter of all woodland in France was destroyed during the revolution, largely because revolutionary authorities were remiss to regulate the practice. It wasn't until the First Empire that the forests were replanted and protected by law. Another problem that popped up was the tendency for corporate farms to outbid their smaller competitors. The maximum had laws for minimum wages that had to be paid to agricultural workers, but it also had maximal wages. With the repeal, the large farms could simply afford to outpay the communal farms and score the majority of seasonal workers, further diminishing yields from the villages. This outbidding, along with many other grievances, generated a lot of ill will among the peasantry for the corporate farms. However, in one of the few out-and-out revolutionary boons for small farmers, they were able to take their complaints to local justices of the peace, elected by the community. Even still, about the lack of affordable labour, there was little the JPs could do. Rural workers were just in short supply as so many were off to war. This in turn meant that those who remained frequently struck for higher wages or better conditions. It was especially so in the southern and eastern departments, close to the front lines, where food was almost immediately taken to feed the army. Workers were reported to have demanded nearly 6 times their normal pay. It was either that or the farmers could pay with a far more valuable wheat that they just didn't have. Strikes were conducted peacefully and couched in revolutionary language, but nonetheless were intolerable to the local authorities as it imperiled military supply. Generally speaking, these authorities did a good job and managed to stay on top of things, with food that wasn't taken by the army distributed equitably. Shortages cropped up from time to time, and when they did, the army got preference, or else the soldiers would raid the towns for food themselves, as happened near Strasbourg in June. Underlying weaknesses in the agricultural sector triggered the May crisis, but they are not what propelled it. To find what did, we have to move over to the cities, because it's here that the repeal of the maximum was most keenly felt. The repeal would never have been popular or good, but the committee timed it badly. That's because the urban poor, especially in Paris, weren't just going to pay more for bread, they were simultaneously contending with a collapse in wages. The essential reason was that jobs were in short supply, but labour wasn't. The exact opposite dynamic to that out in the countryside. Even though thousands of new jobs had been created or vacated by the war, there were still too few to sustain over 1 million Parisians, in addition to several tens of thousands of out-of-towners that flooded in. They themselves were the result of internal displacement caused by the war, revolts, famine, or all three. A glut of labour drove down wages in an employer's market, forcing many workers to take on multiple jobs, leading to underemployment as well. It was as this situation was at its worst that the maximum was repealed, meaning that the prices on food and rent became literally unaffordable overnight, while at the same time the minimum guaranteed wage was fixed at the level it had been in October of 1793. A wage fix might not have been so bad in and of itself, if it weren't for the fact that the assignat was screwed by inflation. By July of 1794, it was trading at 36% of its initial value. Free trade might have been given a shot of adrenaline with the repeal of the maximum, but at the cost of exacerbating the extreme poverty already endemic to the big cities. With the maximum gone, the first and only line of defence for the poor had been bulldozed. But that did not mean that there weren't attempts made to aid the poor, and this brings us around to public welfare. It's in welfare that we see one of the revolutionary's truly lasting contributions to the social question, a systematized, state-sponsored response to poverty and other social issues. In the French experience, the government stepping in to do something about poverty wasn't new. Under the Ancien regime, royal officials fixed prices on staple goods and sponsored or encouraged philanthropic work to aid the poor. But the point is that these efforts were not systematized. It was done on an ad hoc basis by private interests. If and when the state intervened, it was extremely limited in scope and often temporary. Furthermore, no recognition was given at any time, in France or elsewhere, that economic security and freedom from poverty were fundamental human rights. The closest anybody got in early modern Europe was the idea of Christian generosity. The idea of the state taking over responsibility for public welfare, and just as crucially public education, were not fresh ideas, and the kernel of the welfare state can be found in the writings of various Enlightenment thinkers. But as welfare is inextricably bound up with revolution, few had anything specific or meaningful to say. Economic radicals on the Committee of Public Safety, on the other hand, had a whole lot to say about welfare. Saint-Just, Dvorak and Billaud-Varenne all agreed in broad terms that some sort of welfare state had to be established. On matters relating to food, their approach was fairly decentralized. The committee purchased large quantities of grain and left it up to Claude Payen of the Paris Commune to determine whether grain was needed. He, in turn, involved the sections, having them take on the workload of distribution. The Liberals took their own swing at poverty, with Barrère supporting the expansion of existing charity programs and the creation of all new ones. Generally, these efforts were successful, but generated no small amount of disdain for the government. This was in large part because of the committee's insistence that before receiving aid, the poor would have to put their names on a list. Rural peasants were loath to comply, fearing that to do so would make them eligible for conscription. Urban peasants were likewise wary, as many believed the list of their names would be added to the long list of suspects scrutinized by the tribunal. Thus, despite some initial success, the combination of state welfare and private charity did little more than take the edge off, and thousands of Parisians would still die. Apart from obvious instances of starvation, many died of illness, others were left homeless, and some committed suicide. With so many people stricken by poverty, Paris's many hospitals were quickly overrun. Most had been run as extensions of the Catholic Church, and always ran some sort of poor relief, usually offering free meals or temporary lodgings. But with so many priests departed and the church weakened, these programs usually ended if they weren't taken over by the committee. During the May crisis, the poor once again turned to the hospitals for relief. Overburdened, the hospitals themselves turned to the committee. As it was, there was only one state-operated hospital in all of France, the famous Les Invalides, founded by Louis XIV to provide for the many wounded veterans of his many bloody wars. Using Les Invalides as a model, the committee assumed state control of Paris's hospitals, the largest being the Hôtel Dieu. Their hope was twofold: to aid the poor, yes, but also to improve public health. Hospitals were greatly expanded with new resources and personnel. Their charity programs were also restarted. Public health might be worth dwelling on for a minute, because it's here in the midst of the revolution that we see some of the first real efforts ever made to comprehensively address issues pertaining directly to public health. Infant mortality, for instance, was of grave concern, and was generally higher in the cities than the countryside owing to poor living conditions. Women were invited to come to hospitals to give birth. In the same vein, freed from Catholic stigma, pregnant women could get relatively safe abortions without having to resort to dangerous methods. Orphanages under state control were expanded, and the children made wards of the state. Advances in medicine didn't slow down, and doctors and students pioneered new techniques in the overstuffed wards of the hospitals. They were even permitted to study cadavers, something otherwise frowned upon by the Catholic Church. Prostitution was accepted as something undesirable but eradicable, and so its trade was heavily regulated as opposed to outlawed. To improve sanitation, public work projects were started to increase access to clean drinking water. Though all of these efforts were a net positive for the poor of Paris, most failed to really address poverty as anything other than a short-term problem. The fact is, poverty is not the disease, but rather a symptom of larger economic problems. Systematic solutions proposed by the economic radicals that sought to address these larger problems never went anywhere. Soyuz's plan to divvy out land was left unimplemented, largely because confiscated land was the only thing backing up the rapidly depreciating assignat, and thus handing out land or properties to those who could not use it or could not pay for it would be an economic disaster. In a more general sense, though, that the committee had issued two mutually contradictory reform packages at all would apparently betray their crippling dysfunction on economic matters. On the one hand, the economic liberals favoured a return to the free market capitalism of the constitutional order. Our economic radicals, on the other hand, decried the merchants as grain hoarders and counter-revolutionaries. Soyuz saw no place for this, quote, aristocracy of merchants in the Republic of Virtue. The reason the liberals won out was due to their solidarity on economic matters. Soyuz, Billaud-Varenne and Herbois all approached economic reform individually. Herbois was uniquely aloof. Vain and self-assured in equal measure, he was loath to support any reforms that were not originally his. By April, this trend away from interventionism was being felt not only on domestic trade but foreign trade too, as the committee established commercial boards stuffed with mercantile interests to determine trade policy in France's many ports. That being so, the committee was far from allied with the merchants, and instead determined to limit their influence over economic or financial policy at the national level. A large degree of regulation was also maintained in markets relating to the supply and logistics of the army and navy. Rumours that 1794's harvest would droop below expectations contributed to the general atmosphere of paranoia in the cities. And when this paranoia combined with widespread poverty, the result was an increase in popular upheaval. The main outlet for this passion, as we shall see, was iconoclastic, wherein churches and cemeteries were ransacked. But others resorted to the practical benefits of crime, theft and robbery mainly. Extant networks of informants and metropolitan police had to be diverted away from counter-revolutionaries towards black marketeers, grain hoarders, and merchant speculators. Violent crimes spiked too, and were dealt with, as was the revolutionary way, in a systemic fashion. The modern detective method was pioneered at this time, largely as the result of the need to construct a solid case to gain a conviction in France's criminal courts. At the same time as crime was rising, the people's demands became louder and clearer. In specific terms, the rural peasants demanded the dissolution of the corporate farms, with their lands to be sold off cheap. Urban peasants continued to chafe under exorbitant rents and expenses, and called for the maximum to be reinstated in full. Though the economic radicals lent a sympathetic ear to these pleas, it was Barrère and his fellow economic liberals who held the fort. Reluctant to abandon free trade, they instead resorted to repressive measures to keep the people in check. Payan, for instance, basically told petitioners to get stuffed, interpreting their pleas as proof of a counter-revolutionary plot. Names of the petitioners were even forwarded to General Security, and ringleaders placed under surveillance. Such measures quickly ran into strong resistance, threatening to tear open a rift between the people and the government. In the final week of May, when fears about the harvest were at their peak, the Jacobins backtracked entirely. The convention passed a bill on May 30th, later called the Laws of 11 Prairial. The laws issued limits on the free trade of grain and other commodities, as well as guaranteeing minimum wages and working conditions for rural workers. Departmental authorities went a step further and drafted literally tens of thousands of soldiers and citizens for agricultural work that summer. Cities were ordered to fulfill their own quotas of food before engaging in domestic trade, while profit margins on wine, livestock and cereals were pinned at no more than 10% market value. Though the maximum was not reinstated in full, the laws of 11 Primal were enough to mollify the people. That all being so, the many efforts made to combat poverty were always too little too late, in large part because they were so reactive. Questions around public education, by comparison, were tackled far more proactively. The need for the state to step in as sponsor of national education was a need born of two factors. Ideologically, education was seen as the avenue by which the morality and virtuousness of the people could be fostered. This could either mean in the minds of more cautious men like Barrère and Lindet, people who were literate, happier, healthier, in other words, who just might contribute more to society. For radicals like Saint-Just, however, education was the key to unlocking the potential of the Republic of Virtue. State education would produce the next generation of citizens imbued with the Republican virtues from a young age. Beyond these ideological justifications, there were more obvious reasons to step in. The Gallic Church, traditionally the educators of rural parishioners right on up to the future kings of France, had been completely decimated. And that meant that all their tutors, linguists and teachers were simply unavailable. Still, it's not as though the committee felt forced to take on this task. For years now, the revolutionaries had been pretty obsessed with education, and in year 2 it was the Committee of Public Instruction that led the charge. It was a holdover committee from the days of the National Assembly, and was once chaired by Maurice de Talleyrand and the Abbé Sieyès, but only really got a shot of revolutionary adrenaline when Louis Lepelletier was appointed to the committee. He outlined a vision for a comprehensive state education system, covering today what we would call primary, secondary and tertiary education. 1794's renewed interest in education saw the convention take up a proposal drafted by the Committee of Public Instruction to establish the first of Lepeltier's national schools, a university in which to train up a legion of teachers. Their jobs would be different from that of clerical teachers of the past, who were rather called upon as tutors or sent out as individuals to teach parishioners. This new style of teacher would focus in on specific subjects and work with their peers from a central location. So rather than teachers going to the students would go to the teacher. Unfortunately, the École Normale never got off the ground. It was set to start in 1795 and the Thermidorians weren't fans. What did get off the ground was something called the School of Mars. Without teachers, an education system couldn't do much actual teaching, but what could be done was fulfill the system's other intended purpose, to produce model Republican citizens. Over 3,000 teenage boys, from all sorts of backgrounds, were volunteered by their parents and brought to Paris. Amalgamated into a single cohort, their regional idiosyncrasies disappeared, replaced with revolutionary zeal. They lived in Spartan accommodations in the Boulogne forest, where they learned to read and write, and were given instruction in skilled trades. All the while, they were subjected to military-like discipline and strict standards of hygiene. The most promising were to be inducted into the army, the civil service, or sent off for further education. Now this sounds an awful lot like what Saint-Just had proposed, as per his ideas for education. But fortunately for him, Barrère was of a like mind, and it was he who organised the School of Mars. His reasons for endorsing and organising the program were suitably patriotic, and echoed those of his peers. Barrère believed that the young belonged not to their parents, but rather to the nation, and thus it was primarily the duty of the nation to support the young through education. But on a more practical note, there were thousands of young men, all across France, who were too young to be conscripted, but who were also not performing basic labour on, for example, a farm. The School of Mars may well have been the shape of things to come had the revolution endured, with young men reformed into model citizens. Similar small-scale programs were launched by the committee all across France, with the dual intent being to put the young men to productive work, but also to induct them into the ranks of the sans-culottes as skilled labourers. Some inductees were made apprentices in the skilled trades, while the rest were sent to work in the manufactories that produced things for the war effort. Returning to the limelight on matters educational was the Abbé Henri Grégoire, a constitutional priest representing the Loire at the convention. Like his contemporaries, he firmly believed in inculcating revolutionary values in the citizens. But where the projects of Barrère and Saint-Just would only bear fruit in a generation or two, Grégoire wanted immediate results. He was also a quiet opponent of the rise of the cult of the Supreme Being, which I'll describe in a bit. But basically, where Robespierre's cult was overtly religious, Grégoire believed in a more down-to-earth, direct appeal to the people that could convince them that the Republic was a good thing. He had some success in the Committee of Public Instruction in protecting cultural artifacts, books, manuscripts and items of historical importance, which were otherwise under direct threat from the misguided agents of Robespierre. The way he did this was by proposing that all historically or culturally significant things be placed in public museums and a new national conservatory, even things that were obviously royal, such as the busts of the guillotined king and queen. Destroying these things, he argued, would confer upon them a level of power which they otherwise would be deprived of if they were simply displayed. Books, too, even those which were controversial or outright counter-revolutionary, were to be preserved for the same reason. Nearly 2 million books, once housed in Versailles, or confiscated from private collections, were stocked in Gregoire's National Library. Jacques-Louis David was another mover and shaker on the Committee of Public Instruction. A man of many hats, David had been getting into a lot of weird stuff lately, like designing ceremonial attire which basically formalised the look of the sans-culotte, turning it into a kind of Republican uniform. On May 18th, 1,000 of his latest political cartoons were released to the public, lambasting George III and demonising Westminster. His main interest in May was in public works, specifically monuments, statues and great architectural works that tickled artistic fancy. Entire portions of Paris, such as the Tuileries Gardens and the nearby Champs-Élysées, David planned to conjoin and turn into one massive inner-city garden, the centrepiece of which would be an amphitheatre dedicated to liberty. Obviously none of this went through, leaving David's lasting artistic contributions from this time to be made in alliance with Robespierre, in service of the cult of the Supreme Being. So on that topic, we've been skirting around the edges of the cult of the Supreme Being for a while now. It's weird to think that in the twilight of the French Revolution, organised religion of all things would make a comeback and in a big way. And it was in the singular vision, the inexhaustible will of Maximillien Robespierre, that a new religion was created for France. It must be stressed just how single-minded he was. The idea was almost entirely his alone, and yet it would be, for a while at least, adopted across the entire nation. To understand how, first we'll need to look at the status of religion in France, because in 1794 it wasn't looking good for God. De-christianization, having been sparked by the radicals and the Hébertists, had achieved its only lasting results in the big cities, Paris in particular. In April of 1794, only 150 churches were still in business. Most were abandoned as their priests had fled or been arrested. Others were ransacked or turned into shrines to the cult of reason. In the town of Saint-Denis, later to be absorbed as a northern arrondissement of Paris, the Basilica of Saint-Denis was looted. In the catacombs below were sequestered royal tombs, and above were many magnificent statues depicting various Bourbon and Valois kings. As a natural focal point for the anger of the sans-culottes, the convention had permitted the basilica to be demolished, acknowledging that the people were likely to go ahead and do it anyway. Only a few items of historical or cultural import were preserved. The wanton destruction is often a focus for critics of the revolution, but what they forget is that contemporaries, especially among the Jacobins, were repelled by this destruction. In fact, the Abbé Grégoire coined the term vandalism in denunciation of the act. And though he was careful not to inflame the passions of the mob, and accepted, as did most Jacobins, that a certain level of iconoclasm was perhaps desirable, it had to be focused on only those items which had no value. Grégoire's sentiments were echoed by those of men like Robespierre, who famously remarked of book-burning incidents that, quote, "there is much republicanism in the books of the Ancien Regime." But Robespierre's aversion to iconoclasm ran deeper and far hotter than most of his peers. The focus of his revulsion was, in particular, the cult of reason. This is because the cult of reason was a self-described atheist movement, and Robespierre had nothing but contempt for atheism. In emulation of the philosophes, reasoning that morality was derived of wisdom, and true wisdom was something divine, Robespierre deemed it obvious that the cult of reason was a rejection of both. On a more cynical note, however, the cult of reason was the officially adopted ideology of the Enragés and the Hébertists, trenchant enemies of the Jacobins. The resort to religion for moral regeneration is fascinating, as it seems so out of character for a Republican revolutionary. But here Robespierre was furthering a very Voltairean strand of deism, one in which God existed but was only given form and function by man. Without the cult of the Supreme Being, Robespierre feared, the whole revolutionary project would be undermined. His mantra was terror and virtue, where terror was the eradication of evil and virtue was the inculcation of good morals, something Robespierre believed possible through the cult of the Supreme Being. The specifics of the cult began to take shape towards the end of 1793 and developed further throughout early 1794. Robespierre was so infatuated by these ideas that he came to delegate more and more of his power to his trusted triumvirs, Couthon and Saint-Just. Politics and committee business were an afterthought, a necessary duty to be carried out, but nonetheless a secondary duty when compared to his true calling as a hero fan for the arcana of religion and republicanism. In the months following December, Robespierre gave only 10 major speeches, making frequent reference to virtue. One of these speeches was for a night at the Jacobin Club, given in February 1794. Robespierre plotted the overarching themes of the Republic of Virtue in a famous speech called The Principles of Public Morality. He began by expressing his opinion that the current system was not ideal. Sometime since we laid before you the principles of our exterior political system, we now come to develop the principles of political morality which are to govern the interior. After having long pursued the path which fortune pointed out, despite being diverted by the effects of contending factions, the representatives of the people at length produced a form of government. However, even now that I address you, it must be allowed that we have been impelled by the revolution and the wants of our country, rather than by exact theory, which we had not even leisure to sketch. Next, Robespierre posited what he believed that exact theory should be. What is the end of our revolution? The tranquil enjoyment of liberty and equality, the reign of that eternal justice, the laws of which are inscribed not on marble or stone, but in the hearts of men. We wish that order of things where all low and cruel passions are enchained, all the beneficent and generous passion awakened by laws, where ambition subsists in a desire to deserve glory and serve the country, where distinctions grow out of the system of equality, where the citizen submits to the authority of the magistrate obeys that of the people, and the people are governed by a love of justice, where the country secures the comfort of each individual, where each individual prides himself on the prosperity and glory of his country, where every soul expands by a free communication of republican sentiments, and by the necessity of deserving the esteem of a great people, where the arts serve to embellish that liberty which gives them value and support, and commerce is a source of public wealth and not merely of immense riches to a few individuals. Robespierre went on to describe a total transfiguration of morals, converting them into virtues amenable to the Republic. The end of their efforts, he proclaimed, would see France, quote, fulfill the intentions of nature, the promises of philosophy, and acquit Providence of a long reign of crime and tyranny. The general structure of the cult of the Supreme Being was very Catholic, as one might expect from Robespierre, who was raised Catholic at the Lycée-le-Grand. But the specific implementation looked fairly Protestant, rejecting, for instance, that the clergy were holy, reserving holiness for people alone. A natural order was established in which the human soul was immutable and immortal, but ultimately suborned to a republican God, just as real as the God of Abraham. This natural order placed precedence on human expression and human will as the ultimate good, and in that sense preferred a kind of enlightened humanism to outright deism. Robespierre would go on to describe his as a religion of nature, rather than a religion of priests, a dig at the Catholic Church. Though individualism was respected, fraternity really was at the heart of this religion, a yearning for the comfort of camaraderie. The human spirit would only soar when it was one in a chorus, all espousing the same virtues. And this outlook was expressed as a kind of all-encompassing civic-mindedness, so much so that many commentators call the cult of the Supreme Being a civic religion, wherein it operates both on a secular and confessional level. Those citizens who were seen as particularly virtuous were to be beatified as republican saints, joining the ranks of the martyrs Lepeletier and Marat. Robespierre believed that he too would join this pantheon. There were a few other interesting idiosyncrasies. Nature was sacred, experienced through such things as tranquility, immersion in natural beauty, and even nudity. Robespierre even stated to the convention that, quote, the one true priest of the Supreme Being is nature. There was a mild return to form on sexual politics. As it was, sex itself was largely destigmatized by the revolution. Even things like same-sex relations, while not socially acceptable, were not criminal. But Robespierre himself was quite sexually repressed, and as the sole framer of the religion, readjusted sexuality to what he believed to be a natural middle ground between the outright stigmatization of traditional religion and the current trend towards open sexuality, which he thought libertine and a pointless distraction unless it produced offspring. This puritanical trend permeated much of Robespierre's conception of the cult of the Supreme Being. He placed a premium on certain values like self-discipline, righteousness, and austereness. So too was premium placed upon the centrality of the family, with the primarily domestic role of women celebrated. Robespierre wasn't proposing female emancipation or an end to patriarchy, but certainly the cult was meant to dignify the daily toils and labours undergone by women, likening them in propaganda to the women of ancient Sparta, who raised sons in times of peace and took the place of men in times of war. Though Robespierre had it all mapped out, by April of 1794 he was still lacking widespread support for the adoption of the cult of the Supreme Being as the state religion of France. That would be a big step to take. For the radicals in the Committee of Public Safety, the promises of moral regeneration were enough, and Robespierre found enthusiastic support from Couthon, Saint-Just and Billaud-Varenne. The rest of the committee assented, either out of agreement with reasons we'll get into in a minute, or as in the case of the so-called professionals, near total focus on the war effort to the exclusion of ideologically motivated politics. Still, getting the convention to sign off on such a major decision would take some doing. But there were a few practical upsides that Billaud-Varenne was quick to point out in a speech to the convention on April 20th. He highlighted recent incidents in the south of France, wherein a resurgent Catholic movement threatened to plunge France back into civil war. Remnant dissent from de-christianization, as well as that from general economic deprivation, caused many peasants to turn to the counter-revolution. This state of affairs was well known to the convention, and they wondered aloud why the self-evident benefits of the Republic had not yet turned the majority of people into good and loyal citizens. This was, in large part, what commended the cult of the Supreme Being to the convention. Moral regeneration was cool and all, but what they liked was Billaud-Varenne's talk of festivals, holidays and fetes that would be popular and no doubt build support for the government. They were also convinced that widespread adoption of the cult of the Supreme Being might just bring an end to iconoclastic episodes plaguing the nation, redirecting those energies towards more productive ends, or at the very least harmless ones. Greenlit by the convention, the official adoption of the cult of the Supreme Being as the official state religion of France happened on 18 Floréal, or May 7th. Robespierre took to the podium at the Theatre of the Tuileries and inaugurated his religion. Nature tells us that man is born for freedom, and yet the experience of the centuries shows us that he is enslaved. His rights are inscribed in his heart, and his humiliation in history. Everything in the physical order has changed. Everything must thus change in the moral and political order. Half of the revolution has already occurred. The other half must be accomplished. To complete a revolution half finished. This really was the essence of Robespierre's whole scheme. Religion as the better half of the Republic of Virtue. Something no faction, no king, no counter-revolution could ever derail. For their part, the convention were lukewarm in the whole idea. Most men were deistic, a few were outright atheists, but also immediately that whatever they were, Robespierre was a true believer. Nobody in the convention had the will nor the strength to yet challenge him, and so they relented. For the vast majority, this was the most pragmatic decision. At the end of the session, Robespierre rose and demanded that all citizens be required, from then on, to swear an oath to the Supreme Being, even if he acknowledged that religious freedom would remain intact. Furthermore, citizens would be required to accept the immortality of the soul, essentially a rejection of atheism. Finally, Robespierre declared that a month from then, the cult of the Supreme Being would be unveiled to the public in a grand festival to be held in every city in the nation, the grandest of all of them reserved for Paris. In the weeks following May 7th, the convention launched a multi-pronged propaganda blitz meant to popularize the cult of the Supreme Being before these festivals. Artists were commissioned to produce magnificent works. David himself produced a huge curtain meant for the opera, called The Inauguration of the French Republic. It depicted, among episodes from antiquity, Lepeletier and Marat. The convention also sponsored poets and lyricists, the theatre staged patriotic plays, the papers pumped out copies exhorting virtue and the Republic, politicians gave rousing speeches. Numerous smaller fetes and celebrations were planned too. Existing holidays like July 14th would remain, to be joined by 36 festivals held at the end of the Republican decade. And the largest of these festivals would occur right away, on 20 Prairial or June 8th. The Festival of the Supreme Being, as it turned out, would be the one and only big religious celebration. It was a collaborative enterprise between Robespierre and David. The artist conceived of the festival as a showcase for the Republic of Virtue. Robespierre was far too tempted to interfere in the minutiae, and personally altered plans and edited many of the songs David was writing. As if to confirm this political and cultural ascendancy, Robespierre was elected president of the convention on June 4th. His 2-week tenure rightly interpreted as the convention giving him the reins for this critical period. The actual day of 20 Prairial was a beautiful one. The sun shone, the air was warm, even so the people did not enjoy the fine weather. Though the harvests were better than expected, and the food situation was improving, the atmosphere in Paris was stifled. There would have been almost no organic interest if it weren't for the momentous efforts of David. Because of him, nearly 500,000 people turned out. The day's event started in the morning, at the Tuileries. In the former Jardin du Roi, redubbed the National Garden, a huge amphitheatre had been erected, and delegations from the sections of Paris were arrayed, divided into groups of children, women and men. On their flanks were the people of Paris, the National Guard and their cannons, and numerous public figures. For all, their attention was turned to the balcony of the Pavilion de Flore, where the delegates of the National Convention were positioned, dressed in their finest and decked out with bright bouquets. Among them, a man in a fine blue coat, pristine white trousers, and a tricolour sash stood out. Maximillien Robespierre surveyed the scene, gave an approving wave, at which point the sections opened in song. They sang the current national anthem, La Marseillaise, and then they sang David's Hymn of the Supreme Being, a chant meant to be its replacement. When finished, Robespierre took to the pulpit to officially begin the day with a speech, his first ever public address. The day forever fortunate has arrived, which the French people have consecrated to the Supreme Being. Never has the world which he created offered to him a spectacle so worthy of his notice. He has seen reigning on the earth tyranny, crime, and imposture. He sees at this very moment a whole nation grappling with the oppressions of the human race, suspend the course of its heroic labours to elevate its thoughts and vows towards his highest being. Republican Frenchmen, it is up to you to purify the land kings have soiled and to recall the justice they have banished. Liberty and virtue sprang together from the breast of the divinity, and one cannot remain among men without the other. Generous people, practice justice and render divinity the only cult worthy of it. People, today let us give ourselves over, under its auspices, to the just transports of a pure happiness. Tomorrow we will again combat vices and tyrants. We will give the world the example of republican virtues, and in doing this we honour him again. At the conclusion of the speech, Robespierre was given a flaming torch, which he used to alight a huge effigy. The exterior was a depiction of atheism, burned away to reveal a snow-white statue of wisdom. The middle part of the festival was usual fare. Drinking, singing, dancing, yada yada. Things only got interesting in the early afternoon, as a colossal procession charted a course from the Tuileries to the Champ de Mars, escorted by hundreds of thousands of Parisians with dozens of carts meant to codify the official symbology of the new religion. The first contained only men, fathers and sons, who wore military uniform and brandished their sabres in an overtly martial display. Behind them were mothers and their daughters, looking serene with the white of their cloaks, contrasted by the scarlet of roses. Another of David's songs was sung by a choir of children, while trailing them were a dozen or so carts carrying tools of industry, agriculture and learning. The Statue of Wisdom was carried along too. As the procession went, they passed under revolutionary displays. Red, white and blue ribbons threaded between floral wreaths, tricolours draped from every window, rose petals thrown by girls dressed in white. It wasn't long before they crossed onto the Champ de Mars. At the centre remained the towering Tree of Liberty, now perched atop a huge papier-mâché mountain built over the old altar of the nation. It was a real climb getting up the sides of the mountain. There were paths and plinths and overhangs. The Liberty Tree might have been familiar, even adorned with its own Phrygian cap, but the newcomer to the scene was a huge Roman column, stretching 15 metres into the sky. Hero of Greek legend Hercules stood proudly atop the column, holding in his hand a diminutive figure of liberty. For a few hours, these celebrations carried on as usual. The National Guard and the army marched past, a spectacle in brass and steel. More songs were sung, more drinks were had. Some had too many, some had too few. Robespierre could have done with a glass of something strong to soothe frazzled nerves. He'd been worried since the morning, even refusing to take breakfast, and now nervous energy was gaining the upper hand as the festival reached its zenith, a final climactic speech to close out the day. Robespierre had been writing his speech for months. His dreams were floating in the air, everything now rested upon sticking the landing. Parting a sea of convention delegates to mount the pulpit, Robespierre was greeted by a wave of applause and cheers. Taking a minute, he revelled in this moment of triumph. But maybe Robespierre chose not to read the room, to ignore the subtle hints that all was not as it seemed. On the mountain behind him, fellow delegates gave polite, deferential nods. They also gave each other furtive looks and side eyes. A brave few were openly defiant, quipping about the absurdity of it all. The people, on the other hand, were not so worried about seeming polite. A few let their disapproval be known with shouts and jeers. A few became many, and many became a lot. Abuse was barely matched by acclaim as Robespierre began his speech, a fire in his belly. Pointing to the Statue of Wisdom, he proclaimed, "Atheism. It has vanished into nothingness, this monster that the genius of kings vomited onto France. May all the crimes and misfortunes of the world disappear along with it. Armed either with the daggers of fanaticism or the poisons of atheism, kings always conspire to assassinate humanity. If they can no longer disfigure the divinity by superstition so as to associate it with their own misdeeds, they strive to banish him from earth in order to reign there alone with crime." In reference to the war and counter-revolutionaries, Robespierre said, "It is above all wisdom that our enemies want to chase from the Republic. We must associate wisdom then to all our enterprises. Let us be ardent and tenacious in our anger against leagued tyranny, imperturbable in the midst of danger, patient in labour, terrible in reverses, modest and vigilant in success. Let us be generous towards the good, compassionate towards the unfortunate, inexorable towards the wicked, just towards all. Sole but infallible guarantors of our independence, let us crush the unholy league of kings, more through the grandeur of our character than by the force of our arms." To close out his Sermon on the Mount, Robespierre recited what was basically a prayer. "Frenchmen, you wage war against kings. You are therefore worthy to honour divinity. But the defenders of liberty can give themselves up to thee, and rest with confidence upon thy paternal bosom. Being of beings, we need not offer to thee unjust prayers. Hatred of bad faith and tyranny burns in our hearts, with love of justice in the nation. Our blood flows for the cause of humanity. This is our prayer. These are our sacrifices. This is the cult we offer you." What was, I think you'll agree, a very passionate and very forceful speech, did not have the electrifying effect Robespierre intended. An awkward pause followed his closing prayer, before the applause kicked in. Used to speaking indoors, where the walls echoed, Robespierre's voice had not been loud enough to carry very far. Relatively few heard more than a muffled fire of shouting. Overall, the speech, much like the festival, was a bit of a fizzer, failing to really excite the public mood nor rally political support. Among the people, there was little to no natural basis for this kind of enlightened deism that ignored the forms and functions of recognized traditional religion. The Republic of Virtue was something revolutionaries could get behind, sure, but a godhead? A supreme being? We're all thinking it, everyone was thinking it at the time, isn't that just a bit weird? The only upside was that the civic religion promised to galvanize public support at a moment when the people were flagging. But the convention had now seen the results firsthand. There was no popular upswing. There was only tepid acceptance, outright hostility, and between both, a tethys of apathy. It is on this dud note that Robespierre's political career had reached its zenith. He had climbed the mountain. Next would come the fall.